Okay guys, welcome to a very special episode of Restoration Passion. Today here at Oshkosh 22, we are very blessed to be able to bring to you footage from an ME 109. I have Mike from Midwest Aero Restorations. Thanks for
welcome.
Allowing us this opportunity. So, what is this?
Well, this is a Messerschmitt ME 109. Some say BF 109. That can be used interchangeably. We got this airplane in 2012, but prior to that it was shot down in 1944. Winter, landed on a frozen lake bed, sank to the bottom of the lake. After the Germans shot it up, they didn't want to leave it for the Russians. Sank to the bottom of the lake and was raised in about 1990. After that, went on display around the country and of Russia. Then it was sold off and went to 3 or 4 owners, various collectors.
So the state of the plane was still kind of a wreckage at that point?
It was, yeah. It was still kind of a wreckage. They had gutted parts out of the inside of it, and very, very minor restoration. They really didn't do much at all. The biggest thing that they did do for us, which helped, was they collected a nice usable core engine. Not sure which owner. I think the owner in Australia that had it did that. So through various trades over the years, ended up back in Munich, Germany. The owner who we had worked with, we built a P-51 for him back in 2008. He came to us and said, hey, let's look for he's looking for a 109. So we went and looked at a few other projects. This one had the most provenance. It had history, which was really important to him, and it had a good core engine. So the engines are so rare that if you don't have a core engine to start with, you could run the risk of not being able to find something. So the fact that it had both, that led him to go ahead and make the purchase. In 2012, we brought it to our place in Danville, Illinois. We reassembled it for a quick photo of what it looked like before we started, and then we started work on it. Sent the fuselage back to a great company in Munich, Germany, where they pulled all the usable components out of that and built us a new structure. We did the wings in-house. We started on that in earnest probably about 2015, 2016.
Okay.
So we finished it in 2022 here in May. May 23rd, I believe it was. We took its first flight since all that. And so it's been a long process, but we're really glad to be here at Oshkosh with it.
So when you get something in like this, I'm sure it's very familiar to our tank projects. Where do you start? Like, how do you know where to begin, and what's the flow of a restoration on a plane?
Well, we knew that there were other shops that had specialties beyond what we felt like we wanted to tool up for. It didn't make sense for us to try to build a fuselage when there was already somebody that could do that. So, and when I mean build a fuselage, I mean, take the components, build the structure. We knew at the end of the day we were going to install all the systems, do the final assembly at our facility. So getting the proper data we needed was early on, realizing how we were going to attack the restoration, whether we were going to convert it to AN, American type hardware. But from the very beginning we kind of knew, and with the owner, we wanted to make this a German airplane. We didn't want to convert it. Yeah, it would be easier to maintain it going forward. It would have been a lot easier to build it. But we felt the airplane deserved to have its German authenticity put right back into it. That meant tooling up for metric rivets. The head angles of all the rivets are different than our Americans, so we had to change all of our countersinks, all of our tooling, all metric. Mm-hmm. So we spent a great deal of money just buying rivets for the airplane that would work, that were structurally approved for the airplane. So that was a challenge, retooling the shop for that. We knew who was going to do the engine pretty early in the program, so it was just kind of, okay, chronologically we would get the fuselage out early. A few years later, we do other restorations. We do P-51 Mustangs, we've done some AT-6 Texans, so while we're doing that, we're trying to get this project moving in the background. It wasn't until about 2015, 2016 we really started into the wings, trying to build a fixture for them, make sure that we could take everything apart and get it all back together in perfect alignment so the airplane obviously would fly straight at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. It had taken a flak shot through both wings, but surprisingly they really weren't twisted or bent up too bad, so that worked out real well for us.
So on that note, what components out of the original wreckage are still in the plane, and how would you determine that if they're usable or not?
So, like I said, we sent the fuselage back to Germany, and the Hartmeier brothers, who had all the equipment and tooling to do that, we instructed them to pull everything possible they could take out of the fuselage structure, inspect it, clean it, even repair it if necessary, and put it back in the restoration. So they did that. We did the same concept with the wings. We took every rivet out of the wings. We did make new spars. That's a major structural component. That was a pretty big challenge, but I would say I'm estimating 70% of one wing has all the original wing structure, 30% of the other one. If you look inside the wheel wells here, that's all original as it was in the bottom of the lake.
Wow. And as a restorer, what are some of the more major challenges you had with this plane, and then leading into what was your favorite part of the restoration and the most difficult part?
I would say the most difficult part was just understanding the manuals. It was a couple years before we were finally able to get a nice set of translated manuals that I believe that was done in the UK many years ago. So that helped us really more in the assembly phase. We had a limited set of drawings for the airplane, which was nice. It doesn't really matter if it's metric. We just had to kind of learn some of the specific terms that the Germans might put in their blueprints to understand what they were telling, but it's all metric. It's really easy, it's all in millimeters or centimeters or whatever, so that was pretty easy to deal with.
Okay.
Reverse engineering a lot of the parts, we had to rely on specialists who could take the part, analyze it. If we didn't know what the materials were, trying to make sure that we incorporated it, obviously, in a safe manner back to the original strength or greater. So those were things that kind of challenged us. And dealing, we can't go to the U.S. and try to find parts. So I had a good network of small group of friends in Austria and Germany that helped us source parts, supplied parts for us, even manufacture some parts for us.
Okay. And then, what's the most rewarding part for you being part of this?
Having it here.
Yeah?
It really is. I mean, we've taken a lot of our airplanes to Oshkosh over the years, and we knew we hoped we could get this thing flying someday, but it's a major challenge to fly this type of airplane, especially over across country at distance. So we're fairly close to here from where our shop is at in Danville, Illinois. So we thought we had a pretty good shot at doing that, and just to have it here and share it with everybody really makes it worthwhile.
Absolutely. And we talked about before the plane's not flying in the show, and you mentioned the issues with that. If we can talk about.
Yeah. So these airplanes were fighter planes. They weren't meant to be ground lovers. I mean, if they had an attack they needed to go in, they would jump in the airplane, get them started, and they were in big square fields, and they would take off into the wind and go. So this airplane, if you notice, the cooling radiators are out a ways, and they're not really big. They work great in the air, but ground operations, it wants to overheat. So talking to some of the operators in Germany who are using the DB605 in some of their airplanes, they say about 8 to 12 minutes is all you have from start to takeoff. If you're not there, you're probably going to overheat on the ground. So, and we found that to be the case when we're doing our ground runs. It's a big heat sink. It warms up quick, and so that's an issue. And here, trying to taxi it to a position for takeoff with all the other traffic, it would never happen.
Okay, so hypothetically, from an engineering standpoint, if you were tasked with fixing that, what would you relocate or change on the design?
Well, it'd be hard to. I mean, I think there's probably some more efficient radiators today that we can install in the airplane, and we're going to look at that option.
Okay.
But I mean, obviously more cooling area, but in more cooling area, the bigger the radiator needs to be, which means more drag, and it would change the look of the airplane completely. So that's something that we won't do. And they're out from the airflow of the propeller a little bit, so you don't get a lot of prop blast through it either. So there's not really much we can do other than maybe try to come up with a more efficient radiator.
Okay, and then you see the cooling system and radiators more with your inline engines, correct, as opposed to a radial?
Correct. They're all water cooled, just like your car, with a liquid cooled, using a mix of antifreeze and water, and that's exactly it. It's just a radiator. Okay. And these are controllable. So we've got a position in the cockpit where we could put it in automatic position, and there's a coolant sensor that it's a thermostat that will, when it gets to a certain temperature, it'll actuate a hydraulic motor or hydraulic actuator that'll open and close the flaps. That's in the automatic position, or we can manually open and close them with a hydraulic lever in the cockpit.
Interesting.
And so in the leading edge inlet, you can see there it opens as the rear flaps open, and then as you close the rear flaps, the front lip closes as well. So they're tied together.
So for the viewers who are pretty new to aircraft, and especially the Messerschmitt, if you can just briefly touch on the specs of the plane and sort of how it was used.
Well, of course, it was a German frontline fighter during World War II. The FW-190 was another manufacturer. That was a radial type engine typically. They had some inverted engines later. So you had the the ME-109 and the FW-190 were two of their main fighter planes. And these are very rare today. There are airplanes that were built. These airplanes were built under license after the war by Hispano Aircraft in Spain. However, they weren't allowed to use the DB605, so they had to re-engine the airplane with the Merlin engine. And so it had a four-bladed propeller, and the cowling did not look nearly as streamlined as what we have here with the DB605 powered machine. So there are a lot of the Bouchons that are left today, and a lot of those, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are a number of those that have been re-engined with the DB605 to make it look like this. So there's some operational knowledge with that engine and some support overseas of guys who have been doing that.
Okay. And the setup of this aircraft, the markings, do you know the unit it represents?
Yep, so this is JG-54. It's from the Eastern Front. The early JG-54 group were noted with green hearts on the sides of the fuselage. This is a later airplane. Again, we're sure it went down in winter of '44. The markings that you see here were taken from our skins that we had on the airplane when we found the restoration. Also, we had reached out to a few modeler gentlemen, and one in particular who's very, very skilled with modeling and the history of BF-109s. So we actually had him make us a model of what they thought based off of what they saw on the remnants of our aircraft, and 4100 series, which is the serial number of the work number they call it of the airplane, Messerschmitts, and what those look like with photographs from the war. So a combination of that, combination of what we actually had on our airplane. We had the yellow, which denoted the Eastern Front, yellow under the tips, the yellow under the cowling. All that was still visible on our airplane. So we used all that data and brought this paint scheme together.
So it's interesting you mentioned models. We've done several videos about when you're restoring a real tank. Some of the irony is you go to the scale modeling community, because those guys, with their attention to detail, we've often used a scale model to go back to the real thing. Did you guys lean on any of the scale modelers to get this restoration done? Mostly
with the paint scheme.
Right.
We knew we knew the aircraft systems. We did a lot of research on the markings. We knew what we needed to do there. What I was concerned about was getting the colors right, getting the patterns right, and getting the finish right. We could have done a spectacular restoration on the inside, but if we screwed up the paint scheme, that would have been the worst. So, and we knew that from the very beginning, and that kind of worried us. But I think we've got a lot of fantastic comments about how it came out finish-wise, and we're happy with it as well. So
some of the testament of the accuracy leans on the modeling community.
Absolutely.
So for those of you out there who build models, take comfort in the fact that in some cases your work on a model can influence backwards to the real thing that the model originally came from.
Exactly.
So very interesting. Does this plane have a name like nose art? Were the Germans big on that as well, or not as much?
A lot of times, for instance, there was another ME-109 that flew in the 90s, and it was Black 6, so they called it Black 6. It just had a big number 6 on the side, and that was the airplane in that unit. There's Black 8, there's Red 7. So this one is the markings of a technical officer, and so there's no real name that we know of that would be applied to this, and there's certainly no nose art or anything else, obviously, on the airplane.
Cool. So one interesting topic a lot of our guys talk about with armor is the engineering complexity of German tanks, and where the Russians, the US, and a lot of the Allies had the advantage of creating the interchangeable parts, and then everybody knows how Germany functioned with quote-unquote the micromanagement of designs. Does that reflect in the aircraft world as well? Like, you've worked on Mustangs. Do you see a same thing where you see an area simplicity in a US aircraft, and then you come onto the German stuff and you just like, what is this? Like,
yeah, well, we did notice a lot of that, but we knew that the airplane was designed to be mass produced, and while we look at some of it and we wonder why did they do it that way. And if you step back a little bit, we can see how they did it. One of the most interesting things I could point out real quick, if anybody understands about how structural parts are formed, they're typically formed in a soft condition, so you could get the form. If it's at its finished alloy, you can if you make a bend or you try to stretch something, it'll crack. It's too hard. So a lot of stuff is formed in what we call an O condition, a soft condition. So these fuselage panels here, each section is formed, and it's just formed in this half, and then there's another half on the other side. The most coolest thing we've seen about this is this right on this edge and right on this edge, it takes a slight joggle so that this skin will sit flush with this skin. Not only does it do that, it takes another 90-degree turn and forms the rib that's on the inside. So in a Mustang, for instance, we have ribs that we put in there, and then we butt the skins together and we shoot it into the flange on the back side. But if I took this clamshell out, you'd have a rib here making the former and the skin assembly. So they've made this one and then a flat sheet. They did the same thing here with another formed skin section and a flat sheet. So they just did that, split down the top, put a stringer together. They come together, so they had one row of rivets at the top, one row of rivets at the bottom, and that riveted the monocoque back fuselage together.
So the skin or the body it's like a self-forming frame.
Yes,
in a way.
Exactly. So that was really unique and kind of cool. And again, there was a shop in Munich that had tooling, and there was no way we were going to try to make a tool. I mean, the tooling is very expensive for something like that. So again, they make that in a soft condition. Then they have to heat it up to a certain temperature and quench it, and hope it doesn't twist up, which can happen. But they did a great job, and then you can assemble it after that. So again, all that complex shape needs to be done in a very soft state of the aluminum.
It's very interesting. I didn't know that about the German planes. And we mentioned before flight time and fuel capacity.
Yeah, so one of the advantages we had as the Americans, we had great fuel capacity and range with the P-51. You take away the drop tanks in the Mustang and the fuselage tank. I mean, even today we've got 3 hours of fuel on board. Most guys fly 2 hours. That's plenty. You add a fuselage gas tank at 85 gallons. There's a little over another hour. You get 275 or 108 gallon drop tanks on each wing. There's more time. So the Mustang had great range. The 109 had really not much more than an hour. Very, an hour would be about your max.
Wow.
With internal fuel. So we've got a 300-liter gas tank, drop tank that they used underneath the airplane. So they employed that quite a bit because they just didn't have the range. And it's one of the big advantages the U.S. had over fighting against something like this. So that was a limitation they had. Great, this airplane was fast. It wasn't as fast as the P-51, but it had great turning capability. It was nimble, that was a problem for them.
So the role of this plane, is it leaning more towards air superiority or ground attack or a mixture? Or
I would say, my history of German history isn't that great, but I would say more of an air role. I mean, small arms fire could take this airplane out because it's a liquid-cooled engine. So you hit a shot in the radiator and it's going to be done. So they use this to attack bombers and fight the enemy in the air.
All right, tell us about what we see here.
Yeah, so that's the 300-liter drop tank, which you know, from what I see during the war, they used that maybe more than they did with ordnance. I mean, they certainly could have. They had the capability to drop bombs. There was also provisions where you, on some of the 109s, where you could mount a gun package underneath each wing. This one, there's no evidence that that was ever on this airplane when we retrieved it, but that created a lot of drag too with those big gun pods underneath the wing. So mostly it was, you know, air to air with what was in it. Certainly had the drop tank for capacity. And interesting thing about the drop tank, which is a little different than what we do, is it obviously uses an air pressure to pressurize the fuel on the top of the tank, the air, and it pushes the fuel out of the tank up into the cockpit.
Oh.
And so when you're sitting in the cockpit, along the right-hand side is the fuel line with a glass tube in between. So you could see the fuel as a pilot. You could see the fuel running back and topping off the tank that you're sitting on and that's behind you. So that's kind of cool. And then if you noticed it was starting to run out, you'd shut it off or jettison the tank, and you knew you were hopefully topped back off. Yeah, it did have a fuel gauge in the cockpit for the internal fuel, but that you just had to watch and make sure it was feeding, number one, make sure it was running back there. So that's kind of a unique thing.
And as far as ordnance payload, that can be swapped out to.
Yeah, I've seen photos where they've mounted like bombs and not rockets, but little cluster bombs and things like that underneath the center pod there. But again, I don't see a lot of pictures like that, but I see more of them using the drone. Again, their limitation was fuel. They needed some range, so see a lot of that.
So tell me about the engine. A lot of our guys are big engine guys and more tank engines, but what can you tell us about this one?
So this is a very rare Daimler-Benz, Mercedes-Benz, they call it DB605A, and it's a 1,475 horsepower inverted V12 fuel-injected engine. So it has a supercharger, which is what you see here with that blue ring around it. So the air comes in the side of the cowling with a big snorkel or whatever you want to call it, big inlet, and it just goes right into the side of the engine. It has a real unique sound because of that supercharger. It has a beautiful whine to it, and whether you're running it on the ground or it's coming at you on a low pass, you can just hear that supercharger whining, and it's really impressive. Real throaty sound with the exhaust, and of course right here is your coolant tank. Up here you have a hydraulic tank. That's what operates the hydraulics, which are for the landing gear. So the cooling flaps in the back, and that's pretty much it on that. The oil tank is up front here, and it's a big half moon shaped tank. We fill it right through this opening here, and try to keep all the systems together. You can see the spark plugs here for the heads. Again, it's an inverted engine, so it's a dry sump engine, and there's scavenge pumps and the rocker covers underneath the engine here in the back that scavenge all the oil out of the engine, push it through the oil cooler and back up to the oil tank, and then it starts its cycle again. And
is it one-to-one drive shaft, or do we have a reduction there?
We do. We have a gear reduction in there, and the interesting thing about that is inside the engine there's a cavity that's completely separate from the internal workings of the engine, but it's a cavity that allows them to put a 20mm cannon inside. So there's a big blast tube that runs through the reduction gear, right through the center of the propeller, right out the front here. You can see on the front that's where they had a center line option for shooting the cannon out the airplane.
Wow. Damn. Okay, so on small arms ordnance, a lot of people have asked, and I've often wondered, how you have the twin guns here. What guns are these?
So those are the MG-131 machine gun. We're real similar to our 50 caliber round, and so yeah, they were timed to shoot between the propellers, and there's an electronic mechanism and a timing gear, essentially a motor, if you will, that mounts to the top of the engine that allows that to happen. So the U.S. airplanes had that too. not too many of our fighters, but some of our trainer aircraft like the AT-6 Texan. I'm sure I'm missing others, but they had top-mounted guns that they had what they called an interrupter gear, which would hopefully allow you to shoot between the propeller blades.
So how does that work? I'm guessing it's something along the lines of it's in time with the prop.
Yes.
And the guns are fired by an electric solenoid?
I believe so, yeah. I believe so. And then so the data you get is something from the engine that knows that if you're here, you're okay to fire the weapon. If you're not, it won't let you fire. So it's pretty remarkable.
So the speed of the aircraft or your revolutions of the engine actually affects the fire of the machine gun, the fire rate?
It's a good question. I would think it probably would, but most of the time when you're up flying and you're shooting, it's what we call a constant speed engine, so a propeller. Mm-hmm. So when you're flying, you would dial in, say, 2,200 RPM, 2,300 RPM, and you just leave it there. And there's a governor system typically that you would employ. In this case, it's an electric system, and during dives or climbs, the prop would automatically change to keep that RPM right at 23 if that's what you wanted. Mm-hmm. So similar to American aircraft, we have propeller governors. You pull it back for a cruise RPM or a fighting RPM or aerobatic. In this case, you maybe run it up to 2,700 RPM, and then no matter what you do, the prop would change according to the airplane's attitude through a sensing mechanism called a governor, and that would keep the RPM fine. You wouldn't overspeed in a dive or just chug to nothing, in a climb.
Okay, so we got a lot of gun guys on the channel, and we're going to talk about the machine guns for a second. And I'm given to understand these are a replica.
Correct.
Okay. So, and not really much is known about this gun?
We weren't able to find a lot of close-up data on the MG-131. I mean, I'm sure there's some out there. Not a lot of good close-up photographs until we had a friend of ours who was able to send us some photos of MG-131s on display at the at the United States Museum of U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. So that helped us a lot. These were built by somebody before we got the project. We did not ship the airplane back with them, even though they're replicas. We didn't want to risk any problems with the ATF. So, and even at that, it was several years before we were able to finally get the replicas into the United States, even though they were replicas. So we did everything we could. Finally got them in. They didn't fit really well. We did have the original mountings, so that was cool. And so with the photographs and all the data we did have, we did our best to try to recreate the MG-131 as close as we possibly could. We had to build the feed chutes that you see on the side. That's kind of why those big blisters are on this airplane, to allow for the MG-131 there. So yeah, that was quite a challenge to get all that in there.
So they're going to show us something really cool here, which is the armor plating behind the pilot. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so with American aircraft, we have actual steel plate with a hardened surface on it. And something unique that we found with the Germans, obviously they had armor-plated glass in the front and then behind the headrest. But to protect the fuel tank and the pilot from the back, they, instead of having a big piece of steel, they actually had laminated sheets of aluminum. So there was we think 32 or 33 sheets of about 1/2 millimeter thick, all sandwiched together to make a big thick piece of aluminum, or protected material. Yeah, so the armor plate was still in the airplane. It had lots of damaged pieces. They were all sandwiched together. We took them all apart, cleaned. There was some surface corrosion in between, but it's not really a structural component. So we cleaned it all up, and we actually put it all back in there. So that's the original armor plate that came with the airplane. So if you get a chance to get in there, it's a little bit hard to see, but that would be kind of neat to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And the armor plate, is it just behind the pilot, or does it go underneath?
So it's one big wall up here, so that it starts up here, it goes all the way down to the bottom, and it's in two halves so you could get it in there. So they kind of come up, and then there's a splice plate in between that kind of holds them together. So you take them apart, and then you can get them out of the airplane.
And the point of that is to dogfighting and...
Correct. So it's protecting the pilot and the fuel tank from any action coming from behind.
Okay.
There was also something up high here, a big thick glass, armor plate glass, that would hopefully protect the pilot from being hit from behind. And then the windscreen in the very front is also a thick piece of laminated glass, which we actually had a new one made, and that's the frontal protection. No protection from the side, though. I mean, that if you had any hits from the side, you're done. So.
All right. And can we go through what we see in this one here?
Yeah, so the radio package assembly is mounted back here, and various navigation and communication radios, and that's all mounted on a big piece of wood. We remade the wood and restored all the original radios that we had in the airplane. We were able to buy a few components to kind of help get that assembled. So that's all back in there like it would have been originally. Another interesting thing, in most American aircraft, they use push-pull rods or control cables to actuate the elevators and the rudder. This is more like a flying wire. It's just a solid stainless steel wire that runs back and connects the rudder and the elevator system. So the two on the other side of the elevator, a little bit redundant because it has two for up and two for down, and it runs up to some bell cranks. So when a pilot actuates the stick up or down, those rods come back and hit another horn in the back that raises and lowers the elevators for pitch control.
And then you have, is this oxygen for the pilot?
So that's a modern oxygen. The original oxygen bottles are the blue bottles you may see inside there. On the earlier, was it earlier? Some of the early guns were charged with an air charge.
Oh, yeah.
And this airplane had that in there, although we're fairly confident that it had the later gun where it's electrically fired. So we thought, well, that's a great opportunity for us to put our modern oxygen bottles in there. They would have had blue bottles sitting underneath the battery rack assembly. So we took a little liberty to provide the pilot with some oxygen for safety, and we're using those modern bottles there. Mm-hmm. The battery assembly is still in the back. This is the battery back here, and something for the technical guys. It's kind of a unique, in our mind for aviation, it's a unique electrical system. So in most of our American airplanes, we use the airframe for ground. This is wired more like a house where you have to run a separate wire for the ground, and so nothing's grounded to the airframe structure. So it added a little bit more complexity in the wiring. You know, we couldn't just run power and then ground somewhere. But that's the way they did it. And so there's an actuation lever in the cockpit that turns a breaker on, which allows power to come to the airframe. And then when you're done, you want to shut it off, there's a circuit breaker on the panel. You just push it and it just grounds it and kicks it off back here. So It's a little bit unique.
So the paint job you guys have done on this plane is incredible. And you painted it, right?
Yes, Dave Young, who works for me, did the primary painting, and several of us worked on it. Got it what we hoped was right.
And did you guys create the stenciling and paint through a stencil, or how did you guys do the markings?
Some of the markings we created a spray mask. Some of them we just laid out with tape the old-fashioned way. So that, we painted the entire airplane with the primer, of course, and then we went with the RLM02 primer, and then we went with some of the other colors, just to kind of, the blue that you see, the entire wings were painted blue, left the blue, of course, on the bottom, came back with the other two darker colors on the top, right over the top of the blue. We wanted to just keep kind of the same way they would have done it in the factory.
And the one thing I love about the paint job on this plane is when you're doing camouflage, be it on any vehicle, the idea is not to have straight lines. You have to blend it and create that feathering effect when you're painting. And the thing with the German stuff is the technique they've used here to get the splotches is incredible. So your technique on the gun, did you have to do a lot of practice or talk about gun settings to get that effect?
We did a lot of practice. We sprayed big test panels and played with it for multiple panels, and we were like, oh, that's not right, that's not right. In fact, we actually had the airplane mostly painted, the fuselage, and we came back and tried to model it, modeling, I'm going to say, the splotches, and it just didn't look right. It was too defined, too bold. It kind of looked too polka dotty. But looking back at that, looking at photographs of actual airplanes, some were that way. Some were very just bold. There was just a whole myriad of different types of finishes on these Messerschmitts, and but we knew that ours shouldn't have looked that bold. So we started over. We shot the blue again and came back, and we finally got the technique down. And what we found is that you got to put a lot less paint on there than you think you should. So you just stand back and just real lightly blast it, maybe hit it a little bit, and it's just you just kind of wing it. But like I mentioned before, we had the modeler friend Floyd Warner. He made a model for us, and we took photographs of each section we were painting, and it blew it up to 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And we actually had that in our hand, just kind of walking around and trying to make it as close as to the model, because the model looked perfect in our eyes.
Yeah.
And so trying to get the model to this, that's where our biggest challenge was.
So to achieve that effect, you obviously have to restrict paint flow, but then you have to up your airflow because you get splatter.
Right.
But if you go too hard on the airflow, then you get the paint's drying before it hits the job, and you get that sandy look.
Right.
So there's a lot of steps to get that. The steps in your settings is crazy.
So I'll just tell you a little secret. I mean, it's hard not to get overspray when you're doing something like that. You just get spray, you just get fuzz. But we let it harden up. At least I think we waited a day, and we came back with the finest Scotch-Brite, a white Scotch-Brite pad, and we hit it with that. And that knocked all the fuzz off, but it didn't leave scratches in the finish because it had some time to harden. Mm-hmm. And that really, we were extremely happy with how that came out.
Yeah, we did a video on, we got a T-54 and it looked brand new, and then we did a 3-part video on how we weathered it and the Scotch-Brite pad right in there. What kind of paint did you guys actually use for this?
So this is DuPont, which is a different, I forget the manufacturer now, they've changed the name of it, but it's a DuPont Chroma Premier single stage. And so that's what we've used for a lot of years. We've tried some different paints. This is the first time we've actually done a complete airplane in single stage, and normally we're doing a base coat clear coat with a matte clear. We could have probably done that, but it would have been more difficult and more time consuming. So we decided, you know what, we're going to just do it the way they did it, which they didn't throw clear coat obviously on it during the war. I think it came out good considering, it's our first time shooting all single stage.
And what do you cut that with? Like a hardener and a thinner?
Yes, I mean it has specific hardeners depending on the temperature and reducers depending on the temperature. And then we add flattening compound to it. So the flattener is all mixed in there. And again, we've got a set numbers that we've found that work for us, and we just try to make that mix every time.
And is there a top coat, or this is the paint?
This is the paint, so there's no clear coat over the top. So when I meant single stage, means it's just you spray it on, you're done. Base coat, clear coat, of course, would be different, and that's what we typically do. Like on a Mustang wing, for instance, we would spray the silver, get it just where we want it, and then we come back with a matte clear over the top of it. We thought about doing that with this, but I think it would have been even more difficult for us and added more paint, which we didn't need.
And do you foresee like fading and sun damage with all the shows we're going to go to with it?
I don't think so. I mean, again, it's an automotive finish. It just has a matte finish. It's not going to sit outside a lot anyway. And if it fades a little bit, it would have faded in the war, so it'd be fine with us.
So let's touch on the cockpit. it's not all still in German, or is it?
It is.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we put all the original German instruments back in the airplane. Everything's labeled in German. We've got some cards in the side of the circuit breaker panels, which we can slide out and put American nomenclature, so a pilot can remember that this is for the boost pump, this is for the lighting, things like that. But beyond that, everything is pretty much has kilometers per hour and kilograms per centimeter square for the pressures, and so it's got a fuel pressure gauge, it has a fuel quantity gauge, it's got an oil pressure gauge, it's got a tachometer for RPM, it's got a flight attitude indicator, a directional indicator. So it has a standard instruments you would typically see in an airplane. So to start the airplane, it has a primer, of course, inside the cockpit. Earlier airplanes, you had to come in the cockpit and fill the primer up. It was a little box assembly, and you had to put fuel in it, and then you'd get so many shots of prime out of that. The later airplanes, like this one, we actually have a tank in the top of the fuselage in the back that we keep full, and that supplies fuel to the primer in the cockpit. So on a cold start, we're doing between 6 and 8 shots of prime. We turn the electric boost pump on. There's a magneto switch, which is an ignition switch. We turn that on. It's a pull and push on a T-handle in the cockpit. We pull it to engage a big flywheel, and you'll hear it wind up like you typically would during World War II. And then you push to engage, and it grabs the starter in the engine and flips it right over, and it fires right off typically.
Wow.
There's also a fuel selector we put on the throttle quadrant. There's a position 1, a position 2, and a position 1 and 2. So we go to position 1 and 2. That gives it all the source that it needs from the fuel tank up to the engine. Pretty simple to start, really.
So that, to me, that's impressive that there's still German on the instruments. Like, you guys got every last detail. Very, very good.
Our goal, again, was to make this a German airplane and not an American. Now, it adds a little bit of complexity to operating the airplane, but the owner and pilot is very competent in understanding the differences in altitude. And another thing we had trouble with, these are old original instruments, so when we get them certified for flying in today's environment, they can't leak internally. So there was a company out, an instrument overhaul facility out west that were finally able to get those instruments sealed up so they would hold the right pressures as we go up in altitude to make sure it's to the FAA standards today. So that was one of our last challenges in the cockpit to make sure that was all appropriate.
Okay, and while I think about it, if you can touch briefly on what you know about the crews and the pilots for this thing, to fly a Messerschmitt versus a Stuka or a 190, are these kind of the elite guys, or how do you know the process of how somebody would have joined up and made their way into this plane?
I think early in the war, when they were not under such pressure, they were able to train their pilots a lot more effectively. I mean, I think somebody said they had roughly 400 hours before they got into the airplane early on. Later on, they were running out of fuel. They didn't do as much pilot training because of that. They needed to get these guys in the airplane. So they went from a small little Bucher biplane right into this thing, which is quite a big jump. There were a lot of losses in takeoff, landing accidents in these airplanes during the war, and sometimes the airplane gets a bad rap for that. I think more than likely it was actually just lack of pilot skill, because they were under pressure and they needed to get these guys in the airplanes, and this is an awfully complex, powerful airplane, let alone the fact that it has its complexities for a seasoned pilot. You put somebody with not a lot of experience in flying in general in this, and it's a recipe for disaster, and I think they found that out.
Wow. So we're going to talk about the prop really quickly. I'm not really a plane guy, but at first glance it's uniquely different to the US Allied stuff. It's got the huge nose cone that is essentially flush with the aircraft. If you can briefly go over the functionality and how this prop is unique.
It's really not that much different than the operation of most American aircraft, other than it's got a real nice big fat wide cord. Originally they were aluminum or steel, but today we've had this made out of wood. It's a wood product, and the reason we do that is if you can imagine having an accident of some kind, whether you run off the runway and you get damaged and you hit the propeller. We want the propeller to be sacrificed. We don't want any shock back into that engine, because the engine's very rare, and so if you had a really hard type of blade that wouldn't give, the rest of the components inside the engine are likely to really be damaged horribly. So most operators today are running these I'll call them sacrificial blades for lack of a better term, but yeah, it's unique. It's a electrically controlled propeller blade, so you could change the blade angle. The pilot does that with a thumb on the throttle. I talked earlier about maintaining RPM. So at takeoff RPM, for instance, we would want the fastest revolutions we could get, and it would so be a very flat pitch. After he climbs, he would dial that back, and the prop would take more of a bite in the air. And so you just vary that, and you also do it obviously not to make sure it doesn't overspeed. So if it's too flat and you're in a dive, you gotta open that pitch up to slow the propeller down, slow the engine RPM so you don't over rev it. So that's a manual operation. We also have an automatic operation, and we don't have that dialed in yet on this airplane. So all of our operations are right here on the throttle with the thumb switch. But eventually that auto prop would work, and so the pilot could do maneuvers and inverted stuff, dives, and leave it would stay at right 1 RPM.
So this is really cool. This is pieces out of the original wreckage, and the reason they have these is quite interesting. So what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so during the judging process, we like to educate the judges about kind of what they're looking at and why we did what we did. So if you notice on the side of the airplane, you'll see some brown spy wrap. Most people would look at that today and say, oh, that's not original. I mean, you see that on a Cessna, for instance. But the Germans actually spy wrapped all of their hoses in a brown color. We've seen it in brown, we've seen it in a clear. You can see this one's still kind of a clear, although it's yellowed over time. The tubing for the coolant system was all painted this bluish green. Also interesting, they had aero flow directions so the mechanics would know how it was flowing. This is a piece of the original armor plating that we talked about. This is just one of those 30-some sheets that would, and there's some damage in that one from back when it was shot down.
that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the episode. A massive thank you to Midwest Aero, and thank you for your time. That was incredible. And this is one of the most beautiful restorations, plane or tank, I have ever seen, and full credit to you guys and your team.
Thank you. My team did a great job. They sure did. Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you guys again with the next one.